The last thing we're going to do is a couple of dissections, and not really do, but you're going to watch them be done and then answer some questions on them. The two are going to be two different types of worms. I thought we'd be able to compare the two. One of them lives out on its own. You're very familiar with if you've ever dug in the dirt, gone fishing. That's the earthworm. The other one is the ascaris worm. The ascaris worm is smaller than the large earthworms, the Canadian ones that you go fishing with, but they can be good size. They can be about the size of a normal earthworm you just dig up, but they have a different environment that they're used to, and they aren't out there supporting themselves, and you'll see the difference when an animal has to provide food for itself and when it's actually going to have the food delivered to it, and what's the difference in the structure and how God put them together. You're going to need to know the classification, the taxonomy, and so I will keep talking, but the taxonomy is here. Here's the earthworm, the more familiar one, and you can go back in the video when you need to and you can find this, but you'll know where it is. And for the other one, the ascaris, there is the classification as you go down, and we'll start with the ascaris as far as the dissection. You will download both of the sheets, and as you go through and watch this, then they will help you fill them out. Partway through the ascaris one, it will break. The person doing it she doesn't actually stop, but the video will stop, and I'll break it into letting you see the worm in its natural environment a little bit, kind of in its natural environment, you'll see. And at the end of the ascaris dissection, there's a sheet from the CDC, which we've heard way too much about now, the Center for Disease Control, and it talks about what are the symptoms, and more importantly, the prevention, how it gets passed, and you will definitely realize that it's important for not only workers to wash their hands before going back to work, but also all of us, because of what you see or what you read there. So there's no questions with that. That's just kind of information. And then there will be the going through the roundworm dissection, and your video will ask you whether you had a male or a female, which you think, how do you tell in worms? But you'll see that it's actually very, very obvious in the roundworms whether you have a male or female. And you don't have to answer whether you had a male or female, because you will see both. They're going to show you the anatomy of both of them. And when you get to the earthworm, there is no gender in earthworms. They are actually both genders. They're hermaphroditic, and that's why there are so many earthworms every time they come up. And two earthworms mate. Both earthworms have a sac full of fertilized eggs, which was God's way of really building up the bottom of the food chain, that there are plenty of animals that live almost entirely on earthworms because there are so many of them. All right, I will let you go ahead and get to the dissections.
So these animals that you're seeing here are roundworms. They're intestinal roundworms, so they are parasitic animals. They're in the phylum Nematoda. And the two individuals I have here look a little bit different. It's not because they're different species, it's because one is a male and one is a female. And the roundworm is a good example of an animal that displays what's called sexual dimorphism, which basically means that there are one or more characteristics that are usually visible externally that allow you to distinguish between males and females. You could think of more familiar animals, perhaps birds, especially something like a peacock. The male has really exotic long tail plumage, whereas the female does not. So this longer, significantly longer and heavier bodied individual is the female. It's not uncommon in the animal kingdom to see females be larger, since they are the ones that are bearing eggs. And then this smaller fellow is the male. So the size is one good indication of which is which. Another good external characteristic is, you'll note on the male here that the end is quite hooked. Okay, there's a hooked end. This is the posterior end of the animal, so the anus is located down here, making this the anterior end. And this hook is involved in copulation. It's used to grasp the female, and also there's a pair of small spines, copulatory spicules, which are used to transfer sperm to the female. So speaking of that, there is one other externally visible characteristic on the female. It's difficult to find, but I'll show you about where it is just in case you can locate it. So we've seen on the male, this is the posterior end, this is the anterior end. So same on the female, posterior, anterior. If we look closely at the female's anterior, the tip of her anterior end, there is actually right here, there's a number of very small lobes, and those are surrounding the mouth. So if you see those, you know you're at the anterior end. So now that we've found the anterior end, we know that if we travel about a third of the way down the length of the body, we should be able to find what's called the genital pore, and this is the hole essentially that enters into the vagina, and that's where sperm is transferred into from the male. So looking down here, I can see it. I don't know if you can see it on the video. It's a small little pinprick sized hole. It's located right here. So just to give you a sense where that is. So now we're going to look at the internal anatomy of the roundworm, first starting with the female. Just to orient you, up here I have the anterior end, which has the mouth. At the other side is the posterior, which has the anus. Okay. Now, running the entire length of the body from the mouth to the anus is this long, thin, flat, ribbon-like structure. This is the intestine, okay? And obviously this is responsible for the passage of food from the mouth through the intestine. And unlike other animals we've seen so far, this is a complete digestive system in that it has both a mouth and an anus. Now, the next thing that we need to note is that the rest of the body cavity is largely filled with a series of long, coiled tubes of various thicknesses and lengths. We'll start at this end. You'll note there are two thick round tubes here and here. Okay, those are the uteri. Okay, so that's plural for uterus. So this is one uterus, two uterus, and you can see that they meet at this Y or V-shaped junction right here. Okay, and right at the end of it, there's a small little passageway there, and that passes directly out to the exterior of the animal through the genital pore, which you saw on the external anatomy. So this is where sperm enters and where eggs exit, is the genital pore. So that's closer to the anterior end of the body. Now we can follow these uteri pretty much the entire length of the body. Here they are here. There's more down here, these two thick tubes. So those are the uteri, and then eventually down near the bottom, they narrow off into these much thinner little spaghetti-like structures, and further on, even thinner, very, very thin and delicate little threads down here. That's a big coil of them, and those are the oviducts and the ovaries. So the ovaries are very, very fine, and it can be very hard to discern them, but so basically the ovaries obviously are the site where eggs are produced. Those pass through the oviducts into the uterus. Okay, that's where fertilization occurs, and then they're passed externally via the genital pore. Okay, so that's the female. Now we'll look at the male, and just be aware that I have flipped it so its anatomy is reversed in terms of its orientation. You'll note right away that there is the hooked posterior here, so we're down at the posterior end of the animal, and then the anterior is that which has the mouth down here at the tip. Okay, so the setup in the male is similar in some ways, different in others. We can see again this very flat, thin, ribbon-like structure right here, okay, running the length of the body from mouth to anus. That's the intestine. Okay, if we go to the posterior end of the animal, we can see this thickened tube here, and that passes about 3/4, half the way down the body. Okay, that's the seminal vesicle. All right, and that exits out through the anus down at the posterior end of the animal. And then again we can see a series of these coiled little tubes all throughout in here, very fine, and those are the vas deferens and the testes. Okay, and again, it's very hard to distinguish the testes because they're quite small, but again, as in the female, the sperm are produced in the testes, pass through the vas deferens, and then out through the seminal vesicle. So you'll recall then, just to point out some differences, the genital opening for the female is at the anterior end, the genital opening for the male is at the posterior end, and the female has two large tubes that meet at a Y. Those are the uteri, whereas the male only has a single large tube, which is the seminal vesicle. So those are some differences on the interior of the animals, and that's about it for the internal anatomy of the roundworms.
Today we're doing an earthworm dissection, and before we actually get down to dissecting the earthworm, I want to take a minute and go over some anatomy. We're going to start with the digestive tract, which is in green here. In the beginning of the digestive tract is the mouth, which is at the most anterior end of the earthworm. From there, we're going to go into our first dilated structure here, called the pharynx. The pharynx is an organ that actually pulls food into the earthworm. That's its job, is to actually vacuum or pull food, soil, into the earthworm. From there, the soil passes through this long green tube. In real life it's not green, but this long green tube that I'm pointing to anyhow, until it gets to the crop. The crop is a pouch, a very thin pouch, sort of like a balloon, and it's designed to increase in size because that's where the soil is going to get stored until it makes it to the next phase of digestion called the gizzard. The gizzard is a very muscular organ, so if you push on it with a probe, you'll feel the resistance of all that muscle. And it's muscular because It digests and grinds the food. So the gizzard is going to do two things. It's going to release digestive enzymes, and it's going to grind the food up. It's going to mix the soil up with the small bits of organic material that this earthworm wants to digest. From there, we're going to go into the last part of the digestive tract, referred to as the intestine. Now, the intestine is probably going to make up 70–80% of the earthworm. And it's going to be that way for a reason, because we're trying to digest and absorb small bits of organic material mixed in with lots and lots of topsoil. So in order to do that, we have to create lots of surface area. And we're going to do that in two ways. One, we're going to have a very long intestine. And number two, if we look at a cross section of the intestine, you'll see that right here we have an infolding of the intestine, and it forms a loop. And this loop is going to greatly increase the surface area in the intestine. You can see that if the tissue just came straight across, we would lose all that additional surface area for absorption. So this structure has a name. It's called the typhlosoal, and its job is to increase the surface area for absorption. Now let's take a look at the blood vessels. We're going to see three major blood vessels on this worm. The one blood vessel you can see right here is probably going to be the most prominent. It's going to be called the dorsal blood vessel, and its job is to return blood to the headward region. And then we can see some dilated blood vessels here on either side, and these dilated blood vessels are called hearts or aortic arches. And their job, they've been modified to pump blood. They are modified blood vessels, and that's exactly what a human heart is. It's a modified blood vessel, except it's become more modified and more specialized than the heart of an earthworm. Usually you'll have about 5 sets of these hearts. And if you're lucky, you'll see 2 or 3 on an actual dissection. If I turn this over, on the underside, the belly side of the earthworm, you'll see another blood vessel. And this is called the ventral blood vessel because it's on the ventral aspect. And this blood vessel actually returns blood back to the body of the earthworm. Along with that blood vessel runs a nerve. And you can see that nerve right here. It's a very large nerve, and we're going to call it the nerve cord. It's sort of analogous to your spinal cord. And that nerve cord is going to run the length of the earthworm. Now, at the most anterior aspect of the earthworm, up here, this nerve cord is going to form a large, at least with respect to the earthworm, a large focus of nerve tissue where nerve impulses actually get processed. This is called the brain right here. This is the brain. It's going to be very small in the earthworm, but if we see it, I'll point that out to you. Now let me go ahead and put this back together again. And you can see 2 cream-colored organs on either side. These cream-colored organs are going to be called the seminal vesicles. And their job is to produce sperm that will be used to fertilize the eggs of another earthworm. And down here we have smaller structures, going to be similar in color, maybe a little bit whiter, but similar in color. And those are going to be your seminal receptacles. They call them receptacles because their job is to receive something. They actually receive the sperm of another earthworm, and they store that sperm temporarily until the earthworm is ready to fertilize its own eggs. Now, keeping with that thought, we've got another large prominent structure here on the external surface of the earthworm. You can see this band of tissue right here, and this is called the clitellum. And its job is actually to secrete like a viscous material that will eventually become the cocoon. And inside the cocoon will be the fertilized eggs. Now, also noted here, you can see these large flaps of skin right here. These are called septa, and they actually separate the internal part of the worm into compartments. So they are responsible for segmentation. The earthworm is not only segmented externally, but it's segmented internally also. And in each one of these compartments are different organs. Now the actual compartment here, all this space between the wall of the earthworm and the intestine, or the digestive tract of the earthworm, is referred to as the coelom. And the coelom is broken up into segments by these septa. All right, let's go ahead and actually start the earthworm dissection. So we have our earthworm in the dissecting tray, and these are fairly large earthworms. So what I would like you to do is to pin the earthworm diagonally across the dissecting tray. And we're going to take 2 pins, and I'm going to take the 1 pin and put it in the anterior aspect. Now the anterior aspect is going to be the larger part of the worm. This is the head portion of the earthworm, where all the organs are going to be located. And we have to put the dark side up. Now the dark side is very pigmented, and that is the side that needs to be up in order to see the organs. So I'm going to go ahead and put a pin straight in the anterior aspect of that earthworm, and then I'm going to take another pin and put it straight in the posterior aspect of the earthworm, just like that. And again, we want the dark side up. This is the dorsal side of the earthworm. The underside, or belly portion of the earthworm, is the ventral side of the earthworm. So now we're going to go ahead and get to our dissecting. So we've got our scalpel. Note the clitellum right here. I want you to begin your dissection posterior. So anterior is headward, posterior is towards the anus. I want you to start posterior to the clitellum, because the only structures in here are essentially the intestine. So this is where I want you to practice. And if you make a mistake, it's not going to be too terrible. So we're going to start dissecting there. So you pick up your scalpel, you're going to hold it like a pencil. And I like to use the very tip of the scalpel. So I hold it almost vertically. And I'm going to hold it at an angle also. I'm going to grab my forceps and I'm going to begin cutting. Now when I cut, I always cut away from my hands or between my hands, but never toward. You never want to cut towards your hand. So I'm going to cut away from my fingers. And I'm going to start right in the midline. And I'm going to go in very shallow. And I'm only going to cut maybe a 1/2 inch to 1 inch at a time. Very shallow. And then I'm going to take my forceps and I'm going to try to open that up. That cut I just created, I'm going to try to open it up a little bit. I'm going to pull back the skin. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pin it. So I'm going to put the pins in probably at around 30 degrees or less. And that way I've got some room to not only see, but to work in here. So I've pinned one side of the skin, and I'm going to turn the earthworm just a little bit, and I'm going to pull that skin back. I'm going to sort of tent it up. And you can see the septa start to appear. And I'm going to cut those septa because that's going to release the skin. And I'm going to be very careful is to not cut the intestine. If you cut the intestine, you're going to see some black material ooze out, and that is simply topsoil. That's all it is. That's a signal or an indication that you have cut too deep. That's about a 1/2 inch or so. Now I'm going to take the remaining skin and I'm going to pull it away just a little bit, and again I'm going to continue to cut very gently, maybe a 1/2 inch to 1 inch at a time. And I pull back the skin, or reflect the skin as we say in biology, and I put another pin in at about 30 degrees. And I just continue to work my way down towards the anus. So again, I'm going to go ahead and do the other side, working about a 1/2 inch to 1 inch at a time. And I'm going to go ahead and pin this side. Now as we do this, if you're working in a group of 2, make sure that only one pair of hands are in here at a time. So I'm going to go ahead and go down the other side here. And again, I just work my way down a 1/2 inch to 1 inch at a time. And we can see this dark structure begin to appear on top here. This dark structure right here is the dorsal blood vessel. That's the dorsal blood vessel. The space between the skin and the intestine, this is the intestine, is going to be called the cecum. And that coelom, that coelom is our space, is our body cavity. And that body cavity, or coelom, is going to be divided into compartments by the septa I was cutting through. Now, if you happen to cut too deep, and I'm just going to go ahead and show you what's going to happen. I'm going to cut a little too deep here, and you can see the soil begin to ooze out. That's an indication that you have cut too deep. You need to back off and go a little bit more shallow. Now, I'd like you to practice and proceed all the way down to the anus. After you've gotten there, you've gotten in some practice, then go ahead and turn the earthworm around, and let's go ahead and begin working towards the anterior aspect of the earthworm. And what you're going to do is you're just going to cut right through that clitellum as though it weren't there. So I'm going to go ahead and, again, cutting very shallow, about a half an inch to an inch at a time, I'm going to cut right through that clitellum. And I'm going to, with my forceps, I'm going to pull back the skin very gently. You can see some of the septa are still intact there. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to cut through those septa. I'm going to pin this back, making sure to keep my pins very shallow or coming in at a very low angle. Now I'm going to go ahead and do the other side. I'm going to take that skin, pull it back, and cut those septa. And I'm going to work my way anterior. Now eventually, as I get close to the mouth, what I want to do is I want to remove that pin so that I don't bump into that. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to turn the pan again, and I just go back and forth until I complete this. So I'm going to reflect the skin a little bit here and cut those septa. Go ahead and I'm going to pin this. And I'm going to continue my way towards the anterior. Now you can see right here this saran wrap like material beginning to appear. I got a pin right underneath a little bit of it here. And this saran wrap like material, you can see it right there, is simply the cuticle. And that cuticle is going to be responsible for protecting the earthworm, both in terms of dehydration a little bit and in terms of protecting it against abrasion as it works its way through the soil. Let's go ahead and go a little bit further here. I'm going to tent the skin up a little bit and continue cutting. And I'm going to try to be very careful that I don't puncture any of the organs here. There's a lot of good organs here and we don't want to cut them. And we're almost to the mouth. Cut through some remaining septa there. And then one more cut should do it. So the skin's going to be adhering very tight here, so I've got to be careful. The brain's up here too, and if we're lucky, we'll get to see the brain. And there we are. We've dissected our earthworm, and now all that remains to do is to go over some of the anatomical parts. And the first thing I want to show you here, in case it gets destroyed, you can see these white structures right here. I'm going to try to hold this down just a little bit. Maybe we can get a close-up shot of this. And you can see the two little white structures right there at the tip of the pin. Those two white structures are the brain. Eventually the nerve cord ends in those two white structures. That is the brain of the earthworm there, not quite as big as yours. Now let's go through the different parts here. The mouth is the very opening at the very anterior tip. And then the next part of the digestive tract is going to be this part right here. This dilated part right here. That's going to be the pharynx. And then underneath here, this is not going to be possible to see, but underneath this material here is going to be our esophagus. And then we go into this pouchy area. You can see how soft that is. You want to push on that with the probe a little bit. Part of dissecting is not just naming the parts, but being familiar with what the parts look like, what they feel like. And this should be very soft, very distensible, so that it can enlarge easily. If this was thick material, it would not be able to enlarge. That's going to be the crop. And then you have this structure right here. Notice how firm this is. Very muscular, very firm. This is going to be our gizzard, where the food gets ground up. From there, we're going to go into the long intestine. And again, we have this long intestine to create lots of surface area. Traveling along the top of the intestine is our dorsal blood vessel. You can see that dark structure right there along the dorsal part of the worm. This is all going to be our coelom, and you can see the various septa along there too. Now let's go ahead and take a look at these cream-colored structures right here. We're going to have to actually move them out of the way in order to see our aortic arches. So as you're dissecting, just give them a gentle push. Try not to tear them, but just kind of push them out of the way a little bit. Those are our seminal vesicles. And again, those are used to actually produce the sperm. I'm going to move those seminal vesicles out of the way a little bit. Those were the seminal vesicles. Anterior to the seminal vesicles are some smaller structures. You can see it right here. And you can see one right there. And on the other side, they are not as good, maybe down in here a little bit. Those are going to be our seminal receptacles. Those receive the sperm of another worm and store it temporarily until fertilization is ready to take place. Now, what we can do here, I'm actually going to, I see a little bit of skin still left on here. I'm going to pull it up just a little bit and cut that skin away very carefully. There's some good structures there, and we don't want to injure those structures. And what I'm looking for now, after I move the seminal vesicles and the seminal receptacles out of the way, is I'm looking for those aortic arches or hearts. And they're just going to be small black threads. Don't expect a lot. And you can see one right there. If we can zoom in on that right there, that is a very nice aortic arch right there. That's a very nice heart. That's about as good as it's going to get. You can see one on the other side also. If I can tease that out, there it is right there. Another very nice aortic arch. And you can see another one here, another one here. And when you tease these, kind of tease across the worm like this. You don't want to go this way because you'll just rip them in two. So you want to kind of go this way. And maybe if you can get underneath one, lift it up just a little bit, just as I did there. You can see another one come into view. That's all you're going to get. Now, if you can get 2 or 3 of those, you're doing very good. You're doing very well. And there should be around 5 altogether. Sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less. There is no perfect worm. Now, the last thing we need to do is we need to roll this intestinal tract, this digestive tract, out of the way a little bit. I don't just want to cut it up, but I want to roll it out of the way. So I'm going to take my forceps and kind of pull it over just a little bit. And I'm going to cut some of the septa that are holding it in place. Again, keep doing that very gently. And I want to do this towards the anterior of the worm because this is where my largest structures are going to be. And what I'm looking for here is I'm looking for the nerve cord. I'm looking for a white fiber. It looks like a white thread. And I just very gently keep pushing it over, cutting the septa that are holding it in place. And where is it? It's coming into view right now. So I'm going to move this over just a little bit. I'm going to hold this out of the way so you can see this. And if we look in there, you can see this white structure right there. This white, looks like a white piece of thread. And that white piece of thread is going to be our nerve cord. You can see it right there. And then along with it, you can see this very small black fiber running along with it. You can see it right there. You can see it right in through here. Try to clean that up just a little bit. That is going to be the ventral blood vessel. And that's going to run with the nerve cord. And you should know that. And that's going to be it for the earthworm dissection.